What makes a bird a bird? When you see a creature perched on a branch, how do you know that it's a bird and not a squirrel or a bat or even a television set? Every day we see countless things all around us. Most people recognize what category of thing they belong to without much thought. But what's going on in our minds when we recognize something as a member of a category? There have been many philosophers and cognitive psychologists who've considered the process of categorizing, focusing on three interrelated aspects of categories. 1. What defines a category? What makes something a member of one category and not another? What determines where we draw boundaries between different categories? 2. How do our minds represent those categories? How do we translate what's out there in the world into a mental code? And then 3. How do we use those mental representations to classify things in the world as belonging to one category or another, especially when we generalize, which means categorizing a new member of the category that we've never seen before? I'm going to talk about three very influential ideas for how all of that works. Some of the earliest ideas about categories come from ancient Greece and are now known as the classical view of categorization. Aristotle sought to define 10 categories that could encompass everything. The exact categories that he came up with aren't that important for us. What's important is that Aristotle sought to define categories by the shared qualities or features of category members. So a bird is a living creature that has wings, a beak, and lays eggs, for example. This emphasis on features of category members is something that we carry forward to today. The classical view has a very specific vision of how features relate to categories, namely that features are defining. You can think of defining features as like a list of features that category members must have. More specifically, defining features have two aspects. They must be necessary and sufficient. A necessary feature is one that a category member must have in order to be a member of the category. So in defining what makes a category, the goal, according to the classical view, is to develop a list of features that all members of the category have. The other aspect of defining features is that the list of features must together be sufficient to determine whether something is a member of the category. Once that list of features is established, no other features are needed to determine category membership. Let's step away from birds for a moment and use a different example to illustrate the concept of necessary and sufficient features. Defining a prospective romantic partner. Imagine that you are on the dating market and thinking about what you are looking for in a mate. Your categorization task then is to label people as either dateable or not so dateable. If you are using dating apps to find someone, you might be doing this in a pretty literal way. According to the classical view, you should come up with a list of necessary and sufficient features that someone must have in order to be in the dateable category. So of course this will differ for every person, but let's say that my list of features is something like 1. For me, human male. 2. Within 5 years of my age. 3. Someone who lives in the same city as me. And 4, based on my interests, I'd like someone who's also interested in art and music. Assuming that these are the defining features of a dateable person would mean that all of these features are necessary. For example, a person who differs in age from me by 6 years would not be a member of the dateable category. This list of defining features should also be jointly sufficient to categorize someone as dateable or not dateable, so that anyone who has these 4 traits should be dateable, and anyone who's lacking any one of those traits should be not dateable. A human male within 5 years of my age who lives in Milwaukee and is interested in music and art should get a date, even if they, let's say, just happen to be in prison for murder. Might be tricky to arrange a date in that case, but according to the list of defining features that I came up with, that shouldn't matter. Not a murderer was not on the list. Of course, we could update the list to explicitly say not a murderer, but you can see how it'd be tricky to come up with an exhaustive list of all the features needed to be categorized as dateable. Further, an important implication of the idea of defining features is that category membership is all or none. If someone has all the necessary and sufficient features to be classified as dateable, then they're dateable. If they are lacking any one of the features, then they're not dateable. According to this framework, There's no such thing as being more dateable or less dateable. It's simply dateable or not. The problem is, we know that this is not the way that people see category members in real life. We know that some members of a category are thought of as better or more typical members of the category than others. Like a sparrow or a robin would be a more typical bird than a flamingo or a pelican. People are also usually faster and more accurate when categorizing typical versus atypical examples. This more graded view of category membership doesn't really square with the classical view. So while the classical view holds up for some types of categories, like mathematical concepts, other theories have been developed to account for how people perceive many other kinds of categories. From the classical view, we have kept the focus on features as key to determining category membership. What has changed is that we don't think of defining features so much as characteristic features. A characteristic feature is one that members of the category tend to have. Birds tend to fly. Cats tend to have fur. And rocks tend to be gray. Of course, we can easily think of exceptions for each of those. Penguins are birds but don't fly. Hairless cats are, for better or worse, a thing. And obsidian is a black rock, not a gray one. Despite differing from their category mates in obvious ways, most people still know that penguins are birds, hairless cats are cats, and that obsidian is a type of rock. So if features are only characteristic, how do we ever know for sure what category something belongs to? Especially if it has unusual features. Similarity-based theories posit that we consider how similar an item is to categories that we have stored in our minds. Sure, penguins don't fly, but they do have beaks, wings, and feathers. They lay eggs and are warm-blooded. Penguins have much more in common with other birds than they do with members of other categories that have some of the same features, like snakes and airplanes. According to similarity-based view, that is the critical piece. When you see something out in the world, you categorize it into the category that it has the most overlap in features with, even if the overlap isn't perfect. So that's it, right? Problem solved. We used characteristic features and similarity to stored category representations to classify. Video over. It's all done. Well, not quite so fast. Unfortunately, there is a little bit more arguing between cognitive scientists that I have to tell you about. So within the similarity-based views of categorization, there's debate about what the underlying nature of those category representations looks like. So what are those categories stored in your mind, and how do we use them? The debate in similarity-based views is between the exemplar and prototype views. According to the exemplar view, categories are represented by individual category members that you have stored in memory. So for example, your mind's representation of the category of college professors would include specific college professors that you've either encountered in real life or through literature or potentially through the media as well. Like me, regular old Kate Bowman might be just one piece of your college professor category. Other specific professors like Jordan Peterson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Henry Higgins, and Indiana Jones might also be part of your category representation for college professors. According to the exemplar view, when you are using similarity to categorize someone as a professor, the thing you are comparing to in your mind is just this motley crew of college professors. The idea is that your mind can simultaneously activate all the professors stored in your mind, compare the similarity of the to-be-categorized person in the world to all of them at once. If there's a high degree of similarity, higher than to other related categories like doctors or librarians, then you're likely to classify the person as a college professor. So exemplar-based categorization is based on similarity, and the similarity is to individual category members stored in memory. Sounds great.
Not so fast.
Wait, who are you?
I am Professor Prototype, PhD. I am not just one professor, but an average or idealized professor. Or at least what an image generation AI thinks is the ideal professor.
Okay, but what are you doing here?
I am here to tell you that the exemplar view is misguided at best and dead wrong at worst. Categories are not represented by individual category members. Our minds represent categories as prototypes. The prototype is a single summary category member. It is the average of the individual category members, and it has all the most typical features of the category. As the college professor prototype, I'm idealized, I'm perfect, and I'm an abstraction. You've never seen a real professor quite like me, but your mind can create me by combining across the different professors you really have encountered. All right, Professor Prototype, I'll bite. Let's say that our minds represent categories as prototypes. What does the prototype view say about how we use category prototypes to categorize things? Does that differ from the exemplar view? I'm so glad you asked. This is where the exemplar and prototype views are pretty similar. They both are similarity-based views proposing that categorization is based on how similar an item is to the relevant category representations stored in one's mind. The only difference is that, according to the prototype view, the similarity is to category prototypes as opposed to the individual category members. Oh, interesting. So how can we even tell if people are using prototypes or exemplars to categorize? Would we expect differences in how people categorize based on whether they are representing them as exemplars versus prototypes? Another great question. There has been decades of debate about whether the prototype or exemplar view better accounts for people's categorization responses. And there are formal mathematical models that researchers have developed to try to ascertain the representations underlying categorization judgments. Some researchers have even developed models that combine exemplars and prototypes into a single model. Yikes, sounds complicated. Should we make that its own video? An excellent idea. I'm out of time anyway. I'm off to do professory things like lecture, grade papers, and stare off thoughtfully into the distance.
All right, thanks for stopping by. Goodbye, and good luck with that.